Welcome, everyone, to episode whatever this is of Stormgate Snapshots, and this time we're going to get to talk to some of the people behind the scenes, the people that are going and working on the server infrastructure and really allowing this new game, the Stormgate, this Frost Giant game, to look good and, more importantly, to act good, because, you know, it's exciting. If you get matched with someone, it's important. So, Sid, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, you're with Hathora. Can you tell me about what Hathora does?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thanks so much for having me, Philip. Looking forward to this conversation. I guess, some brief background on Hathora. We provide server hosting for the most ambitious multiplayer games around the world. So, if you're building a real-time game where, a few milliseconds of latency actually matters to gameplay, right, you're probably having to host your servers around the world, thinking about how many idle servers do I have in what regions, where do I send players, how bad is their ping in one region versus others. It's a whole set of operational challenges that traditionally studios had to deal with. Hathora actually solves all of that for you. So instead of having to maintain a fleet of clusters around the world, you actually send your server build over to Hathora. And when you have a pool of players ready to start a match, Hathora will actually spin up compute for you dynamically and assign a server for that set of players. So we're really hoping to kind of change the gaming industry in terms of how server hosting is done, because frankly speaking, we feel like this is a common problem that every studio has to deal with. And it's a very similar solution everyone kind of ends up reinventing. So it felt like one of those perfect platforms to kind of provide to studios so that they don't have to worry about this stuff in-house.
Gotcha. Then, so what does that make you different from someone like AWS or Cloud Azure or one of these really well-known kind of hosting platforms?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of studios, this isn't the first time ever that this is being done, right? So this problem has been solved in the past. And in fact, a lot of studios have turned to cloud hosting, picking EC2 on AWS or Azure VMs to kind of host their games. The difference that we see is, in terms of how infrastructure as a whole outside of game servers has evolved in the last 20 years, right? You kind of started with, these workstations that sat on people's desks or in a closet somewhere, to moving up to a rack of servers in a closet, to that rack of servers being hosted somewhere, by a company like Equinix. And then, virtual machines started coming around in the early 2000s. And kind of that was the next step in the evolution. And then, those virtual machines, instead of hosting them on bare metal or metal that you owned, cloud was kind of the transition where, Amazon or Azure or Google provide those virtual machines for you, right? And then the next kind of leap that, we see that took place is basically this transition to containers. And then from containers, what we're actually noticing is this transition to serverless, right? Where it's more like functions as a service. And if you look at the evolution, it's always increasing how much the platform handles for you and decreasing your operational overhead, right? And so that's kind of how we see ourselves as being different from just using a VM on Amazon, for example, right? If you're using a VM on Amazon, you have to think about which region is my VM running in. And then assigning, players to a specific VM, right? And then if one isn't enough, which, for most ambitious games, one certainly is not enough, you have to keep track of how many you need, right? And you're always running an excess of servers in anticipation of customer demand so that players don't sit waiting in queues forever, right? But then once players leave, you also want to downsize those clusters. And then you kind of have to repeat that in every region you want that availability in. And then you have DDoS attacks that you need to protect against, or kernel vulnerabilities where you have to patch your underlying OS. I can go on and on about all the operational challenges that are actually required, even if you're using a cloud VM. Versus the difference with us is once you build your server build and containerize it, you throw that server build over to us. And then we are entirely responsible for everything below that, right? So like number of active servers that we need in order to schedule all the games that are coming in, patching them so that any critical vulnerabilities are addressed as quickly as possible, protecting games from like getting DDoS attacks, and I can go on and on. But the other really key important thing is we have servers available in 10 regions already that our customers can pick from. So for example, like, Frostshine or any other game that's hosted on Hathora has access to a ping checker, which they can integrate into their respective clients and test to see, for a given player, what is the closest Hathora region, right? And then that gets fed into the matchmaker so that the matchmaker can decide, what's the optimal region to place these users into.
Gotcha. I have actually so many questions about several things you just said. So thank you for really giving that introduction into a bunch of things I want to talk about. So I think I'm just going to go by the order in which you talked about it. So we're going to dive in. First of all, you talked about how this is a good value proposition, right? It's you can kind of containerize on top of it, and it's going to be cheaper than putting things on bare metal. Amazon Prime Video recently came out and they said it's actually far, far cheaper for them to host on bare metal, to have their own server setups, than to go into AWS. In fact, it seems like recently there has been somewhat of a blowback against this kind of serverless idea because it is so much more expensive. And it sounds like part of this from you is that because you're really only using servers exactly when you need to and no other time. Is that the value proposition there, or is there something I'm missing in terms of why this is cheaper despite kind of this blowback against the serverless idea?
Yeah, so I guess I want to deconstruct that a little.
Mm-hmm.
So I know which blog post you're referring to, and Prime Video, the way things were set up, they were using serverless in a very Frankenstein way.
Yeah.
Right. It was a very complex distributed system that they tried to build using serverless techniques, where you had like one service that was responsible for the intake of videos, and then another service that was responsible for like encoding it properly, and another for like actually like serving it up when it needed to, right? So you needed this like very cohesive system, this platform at the end of the day. But then the way it was architected was all these like individual pieces that were kind of hard to kind of figure out, right? So the transition they made actually wasn't to bare metal. They actually ended up consolidating a few key services into kind of like these like mini monoliths, so to speak, right? So like all of their ingestion service, for example, was like kind of like baked into one service, and then they deploy that one service on an EC2 instance instead of having it run in Lambda, for example, right? So it's not that they've like said like serverless does not work for anyone and it's just a bad paradigm. It's just like, for their use case, they've actually realized that, in fact, instead of reducing operational complexity, it increased operational complexity, and it didn't actually cost benefits didn't quite make sense for them. In the example or in the use case of game servers, serverless is actually pretty useful because what we're talking about here, there's not a lot of dependency between it's like when you're playing a game, right? Like if it's an Unreal Engine game or a Unity game, there's usually only one thing that you're connected to. And so there's not a lot of distributed systems complexity that comes in. And so when we say serverless, it's actually the fact that we're able to launch your Unity or Unreal backend server very, very quickly. And then, like you said, huge benefit is that you're paying for exactly the time that it's kind of in use for. So that's the pitch on serverless, is that it's not actually for certain use cases, serverless actually helps tremendously, but I think it has gone too far in some dimensions to kind of make that worse. So is that clear?
Yeah. And I think that's just kind of important to point out because, again, the regionality of the location is far more kind of impactful here than being able to really spin things around. And kind of going off that, then you mentioned that you're in 10 regions. Of course, more are on the way. But when we look at these 10 regions, are we looking at if you look at kind of the infrastructure, are we looking at these 10 regions as okay, US East, US Central, US West, where effectively each node is architected to be its own sub-region, or is this something where you have all these regions and it really doesn't matter where it is? It's just kind of a centralizing tool. So I obviously it depends on a game's matchmaking, right? But feasibly, it's all, it'd be interconnected in such a way where I'm playing from Kansas, someone's playing from Poland, and it's kind of all on that same ecosystem. I don't know if that question makes total sense.
Yeah, it does. I think what you're trying to get at is like, what is the purpose of a region, right? Like, is it meant to reduce latency for all involved players? Is it meant for like distributed load, or like
Yeah.
what's the advantage with more regions essentially?
Yeah, that and how interconnected are these nodes? Or I guess how interconnected are these nodes designed to be? Because clearly a game, any individual game can do what they want in terms of how to localize things or, anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So from our perspective, each region is isolated.
Okay.
Right. So the advantage that you get from that is actually higher resiliency. Like, let's say our provider's having an outage in one region, right? None of the games in the other regions will be affected. And in fact, we can actually, like, at time of scheduling, we can actually reroute games that are requested for a certain region to another region potentially, like if there's like internet bad weather occurring around that zone. So the thing is, like, ultimately each game server that a studio provides us kind of runs in an isolated fashion.
Okay.
And they tell us what region that we should schedule it in. So for example, if you have a player in Poland and a player in Seattle, right, you could kind of say, I'm going to pick the region that the first player that joined, whatever region is closest to them. So if the Poland player joined, right, the closest region would be Frankfurt. Right, and then anyone that joins after just has to deal with additional latency and join the Poland server. That's like one approach you can take. Yeah. The other, like, more common approach that we tend to see is actually, like, while people are still in matchmaking, right, you kind of identify what's the best average latency for both players. Right, so for someone in Poland and for someone in Seattle, probably our DC server region would be the best. So ultimately, it's up to the matchmaker to kind of tell us what region they want a game scheduled in. And we give them the tools that are needed to kind of assess, like, pings to the various server regions that we have. But, we don't want to be prescriptive about, like, gameplay logic. And, maybe a studio does prefer one over the other, and we kind of want to leave it up to the studio.
Gotcha. So it's not going to be... I don't know if you're familiar, but like Age of Empires on their Cloud Azure system, they have so many little mini servers that they can pretty much do equidistant in terms of ping from any two people in the world. Hathora is not quite there, right? Where you do have more kind of localized, more centralized clusters, more localized nodes that you're going to be connecting to, rather than what is the I guess the most optimal, most pure, like ping centric or ping centralized location, correct?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. And what we've noticed, right, is actually that if you go too small or like too granular, especially for like games that are, kind of like just coming online, there's not enough of a player base to support enough capacity, or there's not enough players in a given like local zone, right? So like, let's say you pick Dallas, right? Dallas might only have a subset of players that like the pool isn't large enough to make it worthwhile to have a Dallas server, for example. Right. So again, this is one of those things where, like, as we get larger and we start onboarding a lot more games, it probably makes sense for us to like start spinning up more and more regions. But for now, our primary goal is to have a region within 40 milliseconds away from 90% of the world's players. And I think I have to caveat that by saying, like, excluding China, because China is a beast in and of itself.
So do you own all of your server hardware then, or is this built on AWS or Google Cloud Services or Azure or something like that then?
Yeah, so we actually use a mix of hardware providers, and we've done a lot of evaluation in terms of compute performance and consistency. Right, so all of the servers that we're hosting around the world have roughly the same like hardware profile. And then the other thing that we've invested heavily in is actually network benchmarking. We ensure that the vendors that we've chosen have direct connections to, like, the major internet exchanges, so that you're not hopping too many times before you end up at the game server. which greatly reduces latency, but also reduces drop packets and jitter as well, which ultimately like what matters tremendously for a good gameplay experience.
Gotcha. So you work with other people, all right? You are not, I guess, end-to-end server to everything else. You kind of run on top of that, but you have all this optimization to make sure that whatever you're working with really does optimize. And I guess that answers the follow-up question then, which is, why can't you kind of pop up, spin down, like say an AWS or an Azure or something? But that does answer that question there. But I want talking about how you actually the service works a little bit. I'm curious, how in depth or how interconnected is the client? So for us, Giant, in this case, is the connection there? Like, is there some sort of custom slug like Heroku that you put on it, or are you just providing a VM that Frost Giant logs into and they deploy their system onto?
Yeah, so our platform is actually self-service.
Okay.
In fact, like you can log into our platform. We actually kind of walk you through setting up a Minecraft server.
Okay.
So if you have like a Minecraft client, you could actually just log into our console, deploy a Minecraft server, connect to it, and you kind of just get a feel for what the platform actually provides. Right. So we're very much an API first company. We care a lot about developer experience, and even for like some Unreal Engine games, like the time to onboard some customers has been like under 30 minutes.
Wow.
Right.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. So earlier you were asking about what is the value prop in a serverless, like the main value. I would actually say it's the time to onboarding is the bigger value prop. In that, like, most studios can do this in-house if they really put their mind to it, right? But you're probably talking about a team of like 3 to 5 engineers at the very least to like build out the thing, and then even once it's built out, you probably want like 1 or 2 engineers like just babysitting and kind of like monitoring these like global fleet of servers at any given time, right? So like that's a huge piece of the problem that we're taking away from studios that are like building their game. And then on top of that, it's this like performance angle as well, where like even if you hire a team in-house, can you actually spend as much time as we've spent evaluating these vendors, kind of benchmarking them the way we have, deciding which regions are key, and like this is our bread and butter, right? Like this is ultimately like what makes or breaks like our company, versus like for a lot of game studios, this is like secondary or like a tertiary concern, because ultimately they care about gameplay. And like unit movement, and like is the game like overall fun to play? And server hosting is like, oh yeah, like we just need it to be good enough, but like for us it's like we want it to be the best. So that's kind of like the bigger difference that we see.
Gotcha. So effectively, you're selling time is kind of what about boils down to. So specifically, you're looking at multiplayer games. I know you do have this ability. You have the low latency, and you have this easy deploy setup, but is there anything else that makes you all tailored towards games specifically? Like if a company wanted to do, I don't know, run a B2B or something, or anything else, B2B is probably a bad example. What makes Hathora targeted to games specifically? Or is it just kind of that's where you've decided to target right now, and maybe you expand later?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when we first got started, right, so both me and my co-founder, we come from like a decade of infrastructure experience. And we saw this kind of evolution that I was referring to earlier, from like bare metal to virtual machines to containers to serverless. And we're like, well, what's happening in like the gaming world? And like more comprehensively, right, what's happening in the stateful services world? Right? And I'll make it like a pretty clear like technical demarcation. So when you're interacting with a service like Facebook or any like web app that you've interacted with, generally those are stateless applications, right? Your browser sends a cookie with every request that the server then uses to kind of populate the entire state of your profile from a database, right? So like the web server itself it's keeping nothing in memory. Everything, all the persistence is like in a database layer somewhere beneath it. So scalability becomes a lot simpler. You throw a load balancer in between, and then it could go to any one of like N web servers, and it's fine. For games, that just does not work, right? And like more broadly, for stateful applications, that doesn't work. right? And stateful apps are where you have a lot of computation that's happening in memory, where you can't wait to persist a ton of data to a database and read it on the next tick, and then kind of do what you need to, and then write it back and do that for every player, right? It's just too computationally intensive. It just leads to a lot of additional latency as well. And so the way games work, even on the server side, everything's running in memory. Mm-hmm. So if you have like 10 players that are playing the same game session, you can't have a load balancer in front of them and like send them to 10 different servers. They need to be physically connected to the same process. Right. And so all of the architectural improvements that, the enterprise SaaS side has seen over the last decade, it's very little is like transferable to the gaming industry. But the thing is, there's nothing preventing, there's no like fundamental rule or like, physics limitation that says like it cannot be done. It's just there hasn't been enough investment on this side. Right. And so to answer your question, like gaming, we see as like, a really, really good starting point for us. And it's kind of like the most extreme version of the problem that we're solving for. But actually, if you look at it, if you're hopping into an Uber ride, like the driver and you and Uber, like all need to be on the same page. It's sort of a multiplayer experience.
Okay.
Right. Or you're editing a Figma document and it's like very similar to like how a multiplayer game is hosted. So I think at some point in the future, we kind of, see a world beyond gaming, but we think that gaming is like the hardest version of this problem and the most performance sensitive, latency sensitive problem that we can solve. So if we get it right here, we feel like, expanding beyond is not like difficult, but it's like gaming is our absolute focus right now.
Yeah. Plus sorry, I come from a controls background. You talk about data, like the state matrix that a game provides is just, it's got to be massive compared to anything else you're working with. So it makes sense there. But I do want to go back to the kind of this ping distribution thing that we talked about as we kind of get towards the end of things here. But one of the topics that has been, I don't know, maybe in hot debate, but we saw, I think it happened in Valorant a little bit, where players either intentionally block servers or they spin up a VPN, so it looks like they have much worse ping than they do, so they get matched on at servers that are better for them. Have you given any thought to how to deal with that, or does Hathora provide any protections there?
Yeah, I mean that's a very, very difficult problem to solve, and there's like multiple layers, right? I don't know. I don't have a great response because from a technical perspective, it's not easy to identify when this occurs. So then it becomes one of those things where you can identify it after it occurs and then maybe ban the player or kind of, treat them differently. But it's very challenging because, maybe what actually happened was, they had a network blip and, they disconnected from their Wi-Fi and had to like go plug into their Ethernet. And then they saw the same kind of latency improvement as like someone else disconnecting from a VPN to force added latency.
Yeah.
Right. It becomes like almost like even for like bad behavior from players, right? It kind of becomes like it's up to the game to decide how to handle some of these. And we provide the tooling to help them and like provide them with the data, but we don't want to be prescriptive in terms of like how to handle certain behaviors.
So I mean, figuring out like dynamically figuring out whether someone is using a VPN or not seems very difficult. In fact, I mean, isn't the goal of a VPN is to hide that you're doing stuff? But anyway, so that makes sense. So you do provide at least some set of tools to not say, hey, like not to ban or whatever, but at least to maybe detect and say some abuse may be happening here, or is that again purely kind of on the game side?
Yeah, so the ping checker tool that we provide is actually like what I'm referring to here.
Okay, yeah.
And so our customers generally use the ping checker tool when the client is launching for the first time. And so then they reach out, reaches out to all of our servers. Like it comes back saying like, hey, you're closest to like X, Y, and Z. And here's the ping to like, the ping numbers to the rest of it. If that changes drastically in the middle of a game or like right as the game session is about to begin, I think it's like, you could reasonably argue that it's likely that it's because they hopped off a VPN.
Yeah.
But it's again one of those things where if they actually switched from Wi-Fi to Ethernet,
same problem,
right? But the thing is, at least in that case, the distribution is going to remain the same, or like the sorted ordering is going to remain the same, right? So if the order is like, you go from like, London being the closest to suddenly like Singapore being the closest, it's like, it's pretty hard to explain why that could be the case without you kind of hopping through like some VPN nodes somewhere. But again, like understanding and analyzing this behavior is not something that we're putting a lot of thought into right now.
Makes sense. Plus, you'd be able to look at distributions and say, well, this player is experiencing this every single game. Clearly, there's something off versus the Wi-Fi disconnect would be 1 out of 10 or something. Makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I think we've either asked all the questions I had or, well, discussed them in passing. So, Sid, before we go or before we're done here, is there anything that you're excited about Hathora or Hathora's merging with Frost Giant, partnership with Frost Giant that I haven't asked about that you want to talk about?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've been working with Frost Giant for about 6 months now. Okay. Game's coming along really, really nicely. The reveal yesterday was just exciting to see some public material that we can point to as well. No, we're the team is amazing. We're really, really looking forward to seeing how the game does. And yeah, and I think for us personally, we go like far beyond just one genre or like one platform. Like Hathora is actually cross like game engine. We support Unity, Unreal, Godot, and any like JavaScript stuff as well. And we're also cross platform. We can work with like PC, console, AR, VR as well. And yeah, any game type too. RTS, MOBAs, as long as they're session based, we're excited to work with them.
All right, then 2 final questions for you. One, and if you can't answer this, that is totally fine. But we know some players have been playing games remotely on testing. Is that because Frost Giant has deployed to Hathora at this point, or are we still kind of waiting on that?
I know the answer, but I'd prefer Gerald or someone from the Frost Giant team answering.
Fair enough. Just figured I'd ask. And then final thought: if people are interested in finding out more about you or Hathora, we do have the Hathora.dev. There we go. Let's point that way. Link down below. We have your personal LinkedIn, but anything else they should take a look at if they want to find out more?
Yeah, our Discord community is very active. So it's discord.gg/Hathora. And then, we have some very comprehensive docs, and our landing page, Hathora.dev, is a great starting point as well.
All right. So thanks so much, Sid. I think this was awesome. I think this was really illuminating, and I'm excited to see what people are going to think about it. So, well, for now, that's been it. This has been another Stormgate Snapshot. Who we talk to next? I don't know.